of, there's instances of voter suppression, there's instances of kind of restricting the right to vote. Is this fascist? And my answer usually is, well, not necessarily, right? Because like the restrictions on voting is pretty much normative in the United States and in the world, right? But there are kind of some more contemporary valences of that suppression now, or ways that they're trying to suppress the vote now within the GOP specifically, that are leaning towards more kind of classically authoritarian direction than what we've seen in the US. So I wanted to like switch to kind of PowerPoint mode without further ado. Can everybody see the share screen right here? Okay, see, make sure. Okay, here we go. So, and the Charter Oaks flyer for this is much better than this title screen here. So thank you all for that too. Now, one of the things that wanted to stress here before we kind of proceed though, is that when we talk about like restrictions on the vote and to really set up kind of contemporary right-wing restrictions on the vote, have to kind of clear a couple of baseline kind of concepts and really broad strokes history here. So the kind of dominant US notion of democracy has been shaped by Enlightenment liberalism, right? Which is not, we're not talking about liberalism in the dominant US sense of, you know, something that's left to center. We're talking about Enlightenment liberalism in the sense of the philosophies and the practices that were guiding the French and American revolutions of the 18th century, right? On the one hand, Enlightenment liberalism was fueled by this impulse towards equality, you know, the free speech, free press, sometimes voting, equality of rights, the kind of things that were embodied in the US and the French constitutions, but also at the same time, in those kind of founding documents and in the Enlightenment liberalism that was led by kind of wealthy landowners at the time, you also had an impulse toward hierarchy, you know, because these ideas of equality in the 18th century were pushed by an elite landed class that wanted mainly liberal rights for its own narrow group, as opposed to kind of autocratic power in the hands of an aristocrat or a monarch, right? So even in the founding kind of ideas of Enlightenment liberalism that guided the US Constitution, you already have a very narrow conception of democracy that was kind of normative from the very beginning, right? Now, going forward here, though, one of the things with Enlightenment liberalism that, you know, you kind of have as a standard thing, not just in the United States, it's based on liberal rights are bestowed upon a body politic. They're bestowed on the quote unquote citizens that enjoy rights of freedom of assembly, free speech, free press, sometimes voting. But you also have a larger body of rightless people that may be within or without of the bounds of the nation, right? So the rightless might include the enslaved, it might include women, it might include all men without property, it might be the colonized. So all liberalism always involves these kind of dual spheres where you always have kind of a body politic with rights, and you also kind of have a body of rightless as well. And the reason you have that was because of the kind of the capitalist origins of liberalism, where because it is born of a kind of a landed elite, basically, that's wanting to kind of bestow rights upon itself. There's that impulse towards equality amongst elites, but they're at the same time, because it is a capitalist political economy that needs labor and needs kind of rightless subjects for labor, you have a larger body of kind of rightlessness outside of that too, right? So that's part of the founding sin of its origins. Now, going forward here, one Italian anti-fascist I found, Vincenzo Vicerca, in 1933. He was exiled in New Orleans. He had kind of written for a socialist paper at the time, something that I thought was very prescient. He'd written, of course, the bourgeoisie and its struggle for freedom against the feudal caste and royalty had in mind its particular freedom, that is, conquest of power for the protection of its own interests. But there are principles which have such universal value that once established, they penetrate deeper than could have been foreseen by those who proclaim them. The principle of representative government and personal rights, fostered by the pioneers of modern capitalists, became the aspiration of the working class, which, in a century of struggle, succeeded in enlarging the base of democracy to include the proletarians. Now, this is kind of in certain ways, a generous reading of liberalism that's kind of stressed something about it, how it has sometimes operated historically, which is even though it begins with kind of a narrow electorate, those from outside of that electorate sometimes push for rights and push to enlarge the circle of the body politic and enlarge the citizenry through struggle. And that is always kind of from the people who are excluded from it to begin with, right? So liberalism can be sometimes flexible. But in a general rule, and I'm sorry I'm going into the very broad generalities here, but in terms of voting rights, movements on the left have generally sought to expand the circle for their constituents, whether it's the working class, people of color, women, or they seek a new basis for the political outside of liberalism altogether, whether it's communism or anarchism, etc. The right, in generally speaking, has tried to keep the circle of the body politic the same size or even shrink it, right? And that leads us to kind of the next point here, which is just I'm not going to cover just a very, very broad strokes here, and to make a comparison to Western Europe I find interesting. Interestingly enough, kind of propertyless white men in the United States get the vote, and they have it such a broad range because it's state by state. They get the vote in the 1810s into the 1850s, and with a particular push in the 1830s during the Jacksonian era, right? This is when you get finally what kind of white guys without land can vote. That's the first expansion of suffrage that's large. You have the 15th Amendment in basically 1870, which theory gives Black men the vote, but it's limited in actual practice. You have the 19th Amendment in 1920, where women get the vote, white women specifically, but you really in practice don't get the African American vote until 1965 with the Voting Rights Act, right? One of kind of the triumphs of the civil rights movement. And I'm just going through this really basic history, really also to kind of make a comparison here and to state that, okay, exclusion is in certain ways the norm in US history, but also what I've kind of realized when doing this talk too, drawing on some work in like in Western Europe. In most of Western Europe, working class white guys got the vote in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries a bit later than in the US, but through socialist or labor parties, right? And it's worth thinking through that for a second. What does it mean for this body of guys to get the vote through socialist or labor parties rather than through Andrew Jackson, right? And the kind of the racialized, the whole kind of racialized politics of the Jacksonian era of Indian removal and slavery and all these other kind of things. That's where you get your right to vote rather than through socialist and labor parties, right? Now, going forward here, though, oops, I thought this was doing a sequence thing, but I guess not. Now, one of the things we use the terms left and right all the time, and this is getting, I know I'm still kind of in broader concepts here, but when I'm saying, what I'm going to say about the right kind of depends on having this in the background, is that we use these terms left and right all the time, but we oftentimes don't think about what they mean. And left and right is not about so much big government versus small government. It's not about the size of the state. That's not what makes the left and the right. Rather, it's more about one's fundamental beliefs around hierarchy and equality, right? So one Italian political scientist, Noberto Bobbio, in 1996, said that as we move to the left, people are seen as more equal than unequal. As we move to the right, people are more unequal than equal, right? And in my own study of kind of conservatives and conservative thinkers, I found that to be remarkably resilient, is that one thing that unites the right, no matter if you're talking about fascists or more kind of run-of-the-mill conservatives, one thing that unites the right is a belief in social hierarchy, right? And a stated belief in social hierarchy. It might not be a like super solid and firm hierarchy, but it's a belief in hierarchy, right? You know, and so going forward there is a belief that on the right that people are more unequal than equal. And this is deeply rooted in the kind of the views of human nature on the political right, which most major philosophers on the right see the majority of the humanity as naturally prone to irrationality, license, cruelty, stupidity. And I'm not trying to be mean here or biased by stressing this, but I've seen this over and over and over, whether you're reading Edmund Burke or Friedrich Nietzsche or Spengler or Madison Grant, or Bill O'Reilly, you know, like over and over, most of them on the right, their fundamental view of humanity is one of that where most people are prone to badness, right? And so consequently, the impulses and urges in the majority have to be kept in check by leadership and good institutions, whether it is a monarch, a constitution, a virtuous elite, the church, the free market, the strong police, dictator, what have you. The impulses and the urges of the majority always have to be kept in check by leadership, right? And humans are capable of self-government only in specific circumstances, right? The people have to be virtuous. The people have to be kind of disciplined. The people have to be, you know, on some level capable of exercising the franchise. And most of the time they're not, right? This is deeply rooted in conservative and rightist thought, okay? And that fuels a lot of the policies that we see even today. Now, the two major divisions on the right here, conservatives, right, which are in, you know, I'm breaking these down. I'm setting this up so that I can kind of break down their respective ideas on voting. Conservatives, I'm kind of defining these perhaps in a limited way as folks who want to preserve class-based social hierarchies through established institutions, right? You know, but not only class-based social hierarchies, but that's for them oftentimes the most salient ones. And the established institutions that they want to use might be the free market in more recent times, might be the US Constitution in more recent times, might be the patriarchal family, the church, private property, the monarchy, etc. Now, the harder right, as I'm kind of defining it here, tends to be much more populist and middle class, more willing to use violent or revolutionary mobilization of their constituents to rule through new institutions, be it kind of a theocracy, a fascist state, eugenic laws, modern dictatorship, modern military, white ethno-state. And in these means, like hierarchies of race and gender tend to be more salient and rise to the surface a lot more clearly, right? And this is where we get to kind of the more kind of fascist end of the right, where it's a more kind of middle class demographic, and they're not as interested in traditional institutions like capitalism or, you know, again, the market or the monarchy or class elites. They're really after something about more nation, race, action, violence, etc. Right? Now, one of the things that I want to stress here before going forward, both of these groups have profound issues with the principle of one person, one vote, but for very different reasons. Okay. Now, conservatives in England and France by the late 19th century, conservatives are compelled to embrace a mass electorate and wage political campaigns with a mass electorate in mind, right? This is kind of a long, grudging, you know, a long and kind of grudging, you know, consent to liberal modernity and capitalist modernity. They finally kind of give way to like, okay, electorates are here to stay, suffrage is here to stay. But when they do come around to it in England in particular in the late 19th century, they do very well at the political game. They learn that they can, with a mass electorate, they can actually win elections, right? And then amongst conservatives, there's less resistance, at least to kind of an enlarged electorate. That said, their discomfort with a mass electorate never dies, in various places and times. They try to restrict the franchise when the electorate gets kind of out of hand, right? And in the United States, one of the things that you've heard kind of conservatives say more recently, and people on the far right say more recently, you might have heard this phrase of, the United States is a republic, not a democracy, right? And Barry Goldwater in the 60s was, kind of famous for repopularizing that, but it's a reference to kind of James Madison and the Federalist Papers. And he distinguished between a republic and a democracy, meaning what he was really distinguishing between was republic in the sense, when by republic he meant kind of representative democracy, and by democracy he meant something like what we might call direct democracy. Direct democracy might be something like voting by assembly. It might be like rule by town meeting, a lot of kind of workers' councils, things like that. A lot of direct assemblies where people vote on every little thing. He wanted a representative democracy that was kind of removed. So that's a kind of a banal statement in of itself. But when you hear folks now saying the United States is a republic, not a democracy, what they tend to mean is not just representative government, but you're also dealing with a phrase that captures a looser array of a wider array of restrictions, right? And a wider kind of anti-democratic sensibility that's very flexible. Now, there are checks on majority rule in the Constitution, probably familiar with this. Obviously, slavery, the 3/5 clause, it's normative, but, restricting a large percentage of the laboring class from voting, and actually making their bodies count towards the representation for their masters. The Electoral College was deliberately set up as a way to kind of check the popular will. You don't elect, your governors directly. You elect electors, and the electors, if things get out of hand, can always switch their votes. That was very deliberate. Also have the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, which is also was debated at the time. Do you have just a bunch of folks who are not, or just appointed and not directly elected? Do you have them actually making serious decisions, right? And even if you do have a constitutional court, do you do it, in the way that we set it up, right? And interestingly enough, when Eastern European countries, many of them were kind of coming out of communism, they rejected something that looked like the U.S. Supreme Court because they thought, why would you have just an appointed body of people? That just seems really like intrinsically undemocratic. Now, going forward here, I think for time's sake, I need to kind of keep going here. Actually, I wanted to kind of stress, I will show this, like it's about a 1-minute clip from Birth of the Nation, 1915, that illustrates a dynamic about racialized voting in the United States that goes very far back. And what this came out of is there was a reaction to the Reconstruction, and it was basically kind of a very pro-Southern position that was rejecting the very idea of kind of African Americans voting. And I think the way that it kind of puts it out there in this early 1915 film is very prescient for a lot of reasons that I want us to come back to. So I'm just going to show like about a minute clip of this. Hopefully I can get this without ads.
Hi, Chris. Hi, Chris, are you here with us? Chris, can you hear me?
Yes.
Christy, do you need help?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm not going to try to do a clip again. So obviously that, so did you see any of the clip? Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so I will not try a clip again. Are you seeing my share screen? Okay, good. Sorry about that. So I will just skip the clip. I was going to make a point about the way that kind of racialized voting is cast. But okay, but going forward to kind of conservatives and kind of voting and philosophies, what I've kind of found when researching this is that but not just when you go back to the older conservatives of the 18th or 19th centuries, your Burkes, your Nietzsche's, all of that, those folks are definitely kind of hesitant about suffrage. But even more contemporary conservatives in the United States after World War II are very kind of skeptical about voting. Right now, so Russell Kirk, who's pictured here shaking hands with Reagan after receiving a Presidential Citizens Medal from him, was kind of one of the architects of modern conservatism in the United States after World War II. And he was most known for a book called The Conservative Mind in 1953. And the conservative minds really kind of established an intellectual lineage for modern conservatives. First of all, it elevated British philosopher Edmund Burke to a position as the founding father of conservatism. Before Burke had kind of languished for much of the 19th century before kind of being resurrected in the 20th. But also Kirk was a kind of a key figure at the National Review, founded in 1955, very close to William F. Buckley. But what he kind of says about voting in his kind of foundational book on post-war conservatism is pretty interesting. He filters it mostly through his reading of Edmund Burke. And he writes in 1953 that Burke believed in a kind of constitution of civilized peoples, and that for Burke, maintains that a proper majority can be drawn only from a body qualified by tradition, station, education, property, and moral nature to exercise the political function. In Britain, this body, the people, included some 400,000 men, Burke said, and a competent majority should be a majority of these persons, not merely of the whole population taken indiscriminately. Sharing in political power is not an immutable right, but rather a privilege to be extended or contracted according to the intelligence and integrity of a population. Now, what I was kind of surprised about seeing that this wasn't necessarily written in the 1890s or the 1850s, or not in Germany in the 20s or 30s, but here in the United States as the kind of the founding document of American conservatism in the post-war period, right? That it's wholly okay, like he's celebrating Burke for having said that basically the people should be a very narrow kind of restricted realm, right? And so I'm just saying this to kind of stress that, again, amongst conservative thinkers, limiting the vote to people of ability, that minority of the population, the human population that has ability, limiting the vote to those people is kind of what you want to do, and it's natural and it's right and it's proper, right? Now, going forward, this idea of limited franchise is already also there in the kind of market libertarians, the so-called neoliberals. So, for example, this is again shaking hands with Reagan, Friedrich Hayek, who was one of the kind of founders of kind of neoliberal economics. If the majority was asked their opinions of the changes involved in progress, they'd probably want to stop them. I have yet to learn of an instance when the deliberate vote of the majority, as distinguished from the decision of some governing elite, has decided on such sacrifices in the interest of a better future, as is made by a free market society. So those who are kind of architects of the trickle-down economics and architects of kind of freedom through markets were less kind of interested in freedom through other means, like freedom through voting, freedom. And this, keep in mind that they're also writing this, you know, Kirk and Hayek are writing these things in the 1950s and 60s, when in, you know, Keynesian economics were dominant, kind of liberal economic paradigms were dominant, but also in the United States in the 50s and 1960s, Democrats were having kind of super majorities. The whole idea of the New Deal and the social services state was pretty widespread, even common sense. So in this time period, you know, conservative intellectuals kind of writing in the wilderness are stressing the need, you know, or questioning basically what we're actually getting from a mass franchise, right? Now, going forward, here we go. Let's not forget, and I'm going to switch to the hard right in a second here, but let's not forget as we're kind of thinking through today, let's not forget the 2000 election, you know, and the kind of, which was in certain ways a conservative procedural coup, right? Which was in certain ways, all of these theories that were percolating around amongst conservatives put into practice in extremely meaningful ways. Where if, again, I know this is familiar history, but just to get it back on the table, where a conservative majority in the Supreme Court stops a recount in Florida, and in which Gore, like at the time, they thought it was a very good chance he might win that recount. And, you know, scholars who've kind of studied the patterns afterwards have surmised that Gore would have won that vote, right? You know, and so, you know, you have a Republican campaign managed by Karl Rove, involves widespread voter suppression of historically marginalized groups and through a variety of techniques allowed by law, and that were largely at the time unreported by major news outlets. And I'm not going to go through all of those mechanisms. We might, you know, if we want to in the Q&A, we could talk about that. But suffice to say that 2000 in certain ways was far more than what Trump was able to do more recently. That really was taking an election, right? And the Democratic Party was not at that time paying attention to process details and, you know, voting irregularities in the way that they are now, in the way that they started to with Eric Holder under Obama. When we get to the hard right, things are a little bit more, as you would say, frightening, I suppose. Whereas with the other right, the conservatives, you know, you have this kind of long-standing idea of kind of fitness for self-government, of limiting the franchise to the qualified, to the educated, a class-based electorate. With the hard right, you know, and one of the differences with fascism, I think, that you see is with fascism, you get a distinctly a philosophical rejection of voting, right? So Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf says that there is no principle which objectively considered is as false as that of parliamentarism. And basically by rejecting the authority of the individual and replacing it by numbers of some mob, the parliamentary principle of the majority rule sins against the basic aristocratic principle of nature. So there is, you know, again, a very explicit philosophical rejection of the principle of votes that's basically seen as just the impulse of the mob in his view should be replaced by the will of a strong leader. Mussolini was actually articulated in ways that are much more prescient. It was necessary to make our way by violence, by sacrifice, by blood. It was necessary to establish the order and discipline wanted by the masses, but impossible to obtain through the milk and water propaganda and through words and more words, parliamentary and journalistic sham battles. This is pretty typical of fascist rhetoric, right? Where it's a philosophical rejection of parliamentarism based on the idea that parliamentarians just kind of, you know, they yak and they bicker and they don't get anything done. You need some strong leader to step in and just cut the conversation by violence and force if necessary, right? So this is kind of the fascist difference in certain ways. Now, I was going to show clips. That seemed to be a disaster a minute ago, so I'm not going to do that again. But what it's going to show you is very short clips of, in case you missed it, in the January 6th, hearings. The most recent one, when they were showing clips of Bannon and Roger Stone, when Roger Stone basically says, let's cut the, possession in the election is 9/10 of the law. F you. We're going to do what we want to do anyway, and let's skip the voting. Let's get right to the violence, right? And Bannon pretty much says that, well, Trump is going to come out and do what he needs to do, even if the vote goes against him, even if he loses. So what we're starting to see on the right is almost a philosophical rejection of elections amongst some of them, not all of them, but almost philosophical rejection of elections, a need to replace it by violence, a feeling that you can replace it by violence, and in the name of a kind of a racist, hyper-masculinist state. So we are getting, with elements of the MAGA Republicans, we're certainly getting a kind of rejection of suffrage that is of the fascist sort and not just the classical conservative sort. Now, when we also guiding a lot of the stuff now, and this is one of my last points, is the Great Replacement, and the idea of the Great Replacement and the hard right. And some of you're probably familiar with this to a point. Great Replacement is a set of ideas that sees a deliberate conspiracy at work in the world to replace the white race with people of color in nations where they were once the majority, right? And it's oftentimes, and this is what kind of sets it apart, it's often a deliberate conspiracy to replace whites. And the conspiracy, depending on what version of Great Replacement, is either driven by Jews, including George Soros, or it's driven by just globalist elites, multiculturalists, folks that are not necessarily named. But it taps into anti-Semitic theory as well. Borders and ballot boxes are the two main battlegrounds in here. If you control the borders, you control the ballot boxes, you can make sure that you're not having the white race full-blown replaced. And it, suffice to say, I'll mention where else it circulated, but the most important immediate places it circulated is in manifestos left behind by mass shooters, like the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh, the El Paso Walmart shooting, the mosque shooting in Christchurch, New Zealand, in Buffalo, and the Tops supermarket more recently. All of these folks, all of these shooters subscribed and left behind manifestos or subscribed to some version of Great Replacement theory, right? Now, this is very old. Some version of Great Replacement has been going around for a long time. Madison Grant, in The Passing of the Great Race in 1916, wrote a variant of this. Madison Grant was kind of an infamous eugenicist who was avidly read by Adolf Hitler, who said, this is my Bible when he's talking about the passing of the Great Race. He had even written, in the democratic forms of government, the operation of universal suffrage tends towards the selection of the average man for public office rather than a man qualified by birth, education, and integrity. How this scheme of administration will ultimately work out remains to be seen, but from a racial point of view, it will inevitably increase the preponderance of the lower types and cause a corresponding loss of efficiency in the community as a whole. Now, this is, kind of classic eugenicist rhetoric, and it's eugenicism applied to voting, which if you apply, if the lower types can vote, then predictably bad results will follow. But what's striking about the Great Replacement is how closely it adheres to this, now 100-year-old theory that was discredited by Adolf Hitler. Now, the person responsible for Great Replacement, a French writer named Renaud Camus, who's still around. This is him. Actually, he lives in a castle. This is his castle in rural France, where he resides. But interestingly enough, and this is, again, the person who coined the Great Replacement, he started out as a socialist, and he was famous for his creative nonfiction work, Tricks. And Tricks is from 1979. And no, he's not related to Albert Camus, totally different genealogy there. And but Tricks was a novel of, or a creative nonfiction work of, gay hookups across a variety of towns. It was introduced by literary critic Roland Barthes. But it was a bestseller. It made him a lot of money, enough to buy him a castle. And so he started out as a kind of a nonconformist gay socialist, and then switched, right? So published The Great Replacement. I'm not going to butcher the French, in 2012. And it's one of the few things on the far right that has not been translated into English. He wrote a second book that's explicitly for English, but that first one is still untranslated. Inspired the identitarian movement in Europe, migrated across the Atlantic and found home with Richard Wright and the alt-right, Richard Spencer and the alt-right, chanted by neo-Nazis in Charlottesville, who chanted like, you will not replace us, Jews will not replace us. But now has become mainstream in the Republican Party, is repeated regularly by Tucker Carlson, who is the highest rated news person on the air, right? So this manifesto, like that's, the Great Replacement, about whites being deliberately replaced through a conspiracy of globalist elites, and even kind of subject to a genocide, cultural or racial. This idea has moved from mass shooters to Tucker Carlson to Matt Gaetz to any number of Republican politicians who repeat this repeatedly. And this is fueling a lot of the idea of the restrictions on votes too. Now, to kind of take away my final slide here, then leave a bit of time for questions. What's some kind of unique things? Well, first of all, restrictions on voting and the size of the electorate are the norm through most of U.S. history. They're not automatically a sign of fascism. Again, restrictions on voting are pretty old, pretty normative, including in the United States. It's not necessarily a sign we're heading in a fascist direction. That said, what we're seeing now is much more aggressive. It's not just a preemptive attempt to make it more difficult for historically marginalized groups to vote. What we're seeing is more of an authoritarian push to nullify election results altogether and actively mobilizing the Republican base around this effort. And moreover, the current push for nullifying elections is driven by more fascist impulses on the far right, including a conscious rejection of electoral democracy through violence, and racist theories about white replacement that harken back to eugenics, right? So, and also, the last takeaway here is that fascists never come to power after they win elections. Keep in mind, fascists almost come to power after they lose elections or do poorly at the polls. Like whether you're talking about Italy, Spain, Germany, the few handful of fascist states that we have, the thing to keep in mind is that they never come to power through kind of majority will. All you need for that is about a third of the population to be behind it. And the frightening thing about this stuff to me, as somebody who studies this, is that we've seen recently that about a third of the U.S. electorate does have their kind of brains formatted for an authoritarian takeover. And one of the things that that I was going to show in that clip from Birth of the Nation is that oftentimes what you'll see in the United States, because it's Enlightenment liberalism is kind of common sense here in the United States, is that oftentimes and more commonly, you will see a rejection of elections based on an idea of a stolen election than you do a conscious philosophical rejection. So in other words, rather than in the United States, rather than that kind of the Hitlerite thing of like, parliaments are no good, we need a strongman leader, to present a kind of a coup d'etat in the United States, you have to do it as a stolen election narrative, because the idea of Enlightenment liberalism and voting is so deeply ingrained in the population. That said, what's kind of surprising to me is how many folks on the right are even dispensing with that narrative, right? Last takeaway, and I'll leave it up to you, and I don't want to make you complacent. Fascists usually lose in the end, right? But they do a lot of damage on the way, and so it's no reason to be complacent. So, thank you.
Wow, Chris. That was so well done and so clear. And I'm sure that people have a lot of questions for you. Thank you so much for that. I myself learned a lot. Anybody have any questions for Chris? Well, I'll start. In the beginning, oh, by the way, will you make your slides available to us?
Yeah, I can do that.
Oh,
You mean like right now or like later?
No, whenever you get a chance.
Okay.
Chris, there was one of your slides talked about, and you talked about small government versus big government, and it's always struck me as so crazy that the Republicans talk about small government. They want to tell women whether they can keep a baby or not. They want to tell people who they can sleep with and who they can marry, and yet they consider that small government because it's really only about fiscal stuff. As long as the government doesn't regulate, and then that's where the government is either small or large, based on small or big, but based on how much they regulate money. But they can tell people what to do in their bedrooms and in their, and so I just wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that's one of the things that makes some of those frameworks, some of the political theory that I was reading more helpful, because if you look at if you try to define the right by their ideas of small government versus big government, it doesn't work, because the right always has been statist in some ways, right? They've always been in certain ways for a kind of a large government when necessary. The larger thing they're about is preserving social hierarchies, hierarchies of kind of maleness, of kind of class, of whiteness, of heterosexuality, what have you. So they're in kind of the game of hierarchy, right? They will use a big government or a small government to pursue that aim, whatever works, right? And what the differences among them is which hierarchies they're more kind of interested in. But yeah, I think that's a really great question, and that's also the reason why I found like the whole big government, small government question is not really all that useful for thinking through what really makes a right-wing person a right-wing person.
Now that you've scared the bejesus out of me.
Sorry.
And I'm cracking into my whole wine collection here. What do we do now? I mean, is there anything to do other than, try not to freak out?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm an academic, so I'm not the best, like, in terms of political strategy about what you do now, but I wouldn't say freak out. I do, even though a larger, fascists don't need, like, or the hard right doesn't need the majority of the population behind it. One of the things, it is still good that the majority of the population is not behind it, and that the midterms actually kind of showed very specifically that it was those who were pushing kind of the election fraud narrative that were punished the most at the polls. The main thing, is just, I would just say, to be incredibly vigilant, pay very close attention, to Secretary of State races. I think most of us in this room are in Connecticut, so it's not, super, contested, but Secretary of State races and paying attention to who is in charge of vote counting is very, very, very important at this point. And if there are out-of-state efforts to kind of help out with campaigns around kind of election access, that's something as well too. But really, it is, I think, the larger thing is to kind of, if folks on the right, try to engage them in certain ways that kind of steer them around away from this particular kind of, or reinforce non-MAGA Republicans, I gave a talk at the Cato Institute not long ago, and that was not really my bag. But if anybody, I think, who is, not, down with full-blown kind of MAGA authoritarianism, it's worth forming some kind of coalition with them and not being too sectarian. So, Alana, hey.
Hey, long time.
Long time.
Yeah, so I guess it was sort of a similar question, like what are the sort of key institutions that kind of stop that descent into fascism? I mean, I was observing Brazil, a couple of weeks ago, and just kind of waiting with bated breath to see what happened. But it looked like the police ended up, jumping behind democracy. And you saw all of Bolsonaro's supporters saying, well, no, we have to accept this. We have to accept that this is the will of this is democracy. This is how it works. And I thought that was so interesting. And I can't help but feel that has something to do with the recency of their own military dictatorship. So I'm just wondering, like, what are those key institutions, that to keep in our sights in the next, 2 years?
Yeah, I think you said it. I mean, first there was like the who counts the votes, the Secretary of State thing, but as you said it, and thanks for reminding me, it's the damn army. Like, it's who has the guns, right? And as a colleague reminded me, what was kind of frightening about the Bolsonaro thing is he had handpicked a lot of the generals, right? And he was a former military person himself. You have Brazil, which has a lot of its 20th century history under military dictatorship, right? And so, the slide into that it's much more conceivable. It's good, but that said, it's pretty conceivable here. I mean, I think when I don't know about y'all, but I was in 2000. What was it, 2020? I was really kind of terrified. It felt like we were a couple of Secretary of States away from, surrendering democracy, and in much more dire and pervasive ways than in 2000. And I think on some level it's the army, right? The army, like, Trump never really had the support of the military, and it's crazy we're even talking about that, but that's where we're at. But on top of that, though, there is something to be said for norms, right? And that, you have people like Brad Raffensperger who are just like, okay, I'm a Republican, but there's, certain kind of basic norms of democracy I have to hold. But those norms are always flexible, right? Those norms can always shift. And it might not be as common sense to hold this kind of rule of law norm in, 5 or 6 years. So really, I think that, the institution, the most obvious is the military, but also it's, holding a kind of a normative, institutional idea of rule of law, right? And that can shift culturally, and that cultural slide has to be safeguarded, so.
Did you have your hand in? Yeah. Nancy?
Yeah. Yes, thank you. This is not I don't have a well-formed question, so just sort of bear with me. But I'm trying to get a sense of who's doing what in the right. It seems to me that somebody like Peter, I think his name is Thiel, who funded J.D. Vance's campaign in Ohio, is very different than the Oath Keepers sitting at Nancy Pelosi's desk. And I'm trying to connect people or groups or ideas across that spectrum to try to sense what should I be looking for? Who should I be looking for? Is there something that you've already thought through that can help me?
Yeah, I mean, probably not. Probably my answer is probably going to be disappointing, but I'll say there doesn't seem to be, like, obviously one central kind of ringleader other than Trump himself, who seems to have kind of taken a hit in that little midterm election we just had. But I guess in terms of power brokers, like you said with Peter Thiel, it's worth like seeing where those folks are, where the very wealthy donors are putting their money, you know, and it seems like a strikingly kind of frighteningly sad amount of them have been willing to put their money in Trumpism, which doesn't help at all. Willing to kind of, you know, surrender democracy, which is also to me not surprising. But I guess one of the things that's, I was on a panel with you know, a former FBI guy who actually had said something that really stuck with me too, and I'll just pass that along here, is that when he's been studying kind of these fringe groups, right, what we call domestic terror groups, right, like the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, the Patriot Front, all of those kind of stuff, they used to have a real big gap between like their spokespeople and their actual kind of, you know, on the ground terrorist folks, and the people who like would interact with anybody kind of, you know, of influence. But he said the line between all of those three things have fallen apart, where you have your kind of street thugs who are basically directly also spokespeople who are directly in contact with Trump or leaders of the Republican Party, so that those kind of, the line between those like literal fascist shirt movements and real power brokers in the Republican Party has really kind of broken down, right? And the actual kind of street level fascists have much closer access to people with real electoral clout than they once did, you know, and they don't have to, and even, you know, the Trumpists and stuff like that are at least, you know, up until January 6th, we're not disavowing those associations whatsoever, right? But, you know, since January 6th and more recently, it'd be curious to see what happens with this. But one of the things that I found also is that you increasingly have folks on the far right, as they lose more elections, are talking about moving to Idaho and the Pacific Northwest of the US to form kind of a white ethno state, or even if they don't call it a white ethno state, just a place where we belong, including Andrew Torba, who I've been following, who heads the social media site Gab, you know, this right-wing media site or sort of social media platform. He's encouraging people now after the election to move to the Pacific Northwest to form kind of a, you know, a conservative kind of like, or right-wing utopia up there. That again was something that the Aryan Front was preaching in the 90s. Now that seems to be what a lot more of them are doing. So.
Yes, how does foreign interference in our elections figure into this?
Yeah, I don't know. In the last one, we don't know. I guess there was some kind of attempts, the Russian attempts to kind of mess around with things kind of faltered a bit. But I to be honest, I don't know how much of an impact that had in Trump's victory, you know, back. I do know that Putin has been funding kind of far right and white nationalist movements worldwide since 2014. He's kind of thrown his hat fully behind, or thrown his hat, sorry, he's thrown his weight behind, you know, fascist-like movements globally since 2014, including in the United States. But I'm not sure how much that actually impacted. I mean, there's probably people who can answer that better than I can, but sorry.
My sense has been that 2020 and our election that we just had the results that they had because there was less influence. In 2016, it had a big impact, and I think Brexit was also an example of the kind of havoc that primarily Russia caused. But I don't have any. That's my gut feeling. I don't have any research behind that.
And that could be very well. That could be right. You know.
Are there people writing about that?
I'm sure there are. I'm sure there are. Yeah, I'm not like an expert on the kind of the foreign, you know, like influence question. I mean, my sense though is that, you know, that helps a little bit, but I don't think it's decisive. I think that might, on a really close election, a razor thin election, that might tip it over the edge. But I wouldn't say that that's, decisive at this point. But I think you're right. The institutions seem to have kind of stepped in place to kind of limit that kind of interference that we had in 2016. So.
Yeah. Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? Oh, I'm sorry, Quentin.
Actually, I was thinking in terms of more any long-term thinking. Long-term looking. I mean, I've been also looking at Christian nationalism, which is a very long-term project, and would only be really becoming cognizant of it now. But we, and the emphasis there is that we who oppose it need to be thinking long-term.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It seems like what we used to call the Christian right in the 80s and 90s has now become Christian nationalism. And it seems to be part of something that has been developing, but it's just actually kind of developed. It's kind of coalescing in new ways now. But that strand of the right has been deeply authoritarian from the outset, right? And it's since 1973 with like Institutes of Biblical Law and R.J. Rushdoony, which is like the closest thing I've read to an American Mein Kampf, this idea of establishing a theocracy in the United States that looks like, Margaret Atwood's Gilead. That is a distinctly authoritarian strand. And I think we're all of us, including myself, are not paying attention to the new forms of the Christian right as we should, because all of that stuff was wildly visible and in the January 6th kind of attack on the Capitol too, right? And there's some folks will say that the Christian right kind of fell apart with the Bush years, and that movement went into crisis because it was too associated with George Bush, who kind of went down as an unpopular president. But it's this undercurrent that is undergirded, white nationalism. And I think you're right, though, that they seem to have a long game in the sense that they're literally engaging in activities like prepping, like they're if you follow Gab like I do, you'll see a lot of things for like farming and organic gardening and like being able to live off the land by yourself, or kind of stocking up in armaments. They seem to be kind of preparing for survivalist mode, or checking out, or forming their own kind of agrarian utopias, right? And which is, as you say, a long game. For them, it's not something, and it seems to suggest a disengagement with electoral politics in certain ways that they sense is kind of not going their way, at least currently.
And especially after the midterms.
Yeah, especially right now.
But the message is that we need to also start thinking in terms of a long game, and not just the next election.
Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah.
That's kind of the thrust of trying that we need to get ourselves out of that short-term thinking.
Oh, yeah. Agreed.
Chris, I think we have one more question in the chat, and maybe that will end our evening, which, it's just been terrific. Judith asked, what organizations should we join to work against this trend?
Oh boy. I've gotten, I would say, to be honest, I mean, it's all about where you are, right? If you're in, Michigan or Georgia or Pennsylvania, I would, probably have, a list of things that you could go to right now. In Connecticut, it's a little bit dodgier. I mean, I would just say that, anytime, like going back to the earlier part of my lecture, I found that, when Trump got elected, right, I was in part of some kind of explicitly anti-fascist group, right? We were looking for the hard right and trying to find out how we could check the hard right locally and all this stuff. But there wasn't that massive of a hard right. So what we ended up doing is some, colleagues and I and some, community folks in Willimantic, where I lived at the time, we started this neighbor fund, which was this kind of a nonprofit that worked to raise money for legal defense for undocumented immigrants, kind of solidarity with undocumented immigrants. And so what I'd say is, and I found that to be a much better use of my time than actually trying to hunt the right locally or trying to check their kind of advances locally. So I would say anything that strengthens institutions of solidarity, that lessens hierarchies, that kind of works towards equality, no matter what it is, anything that you do in that category that you have a passion for, I think is working to build a better society that is not as authoritarian or kind of prone to the shift to authoritarian rule. So
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was such a great presentation, as always.
thanks, Donna.
Oh God, Chris, you're just amazing. We are so blessed to know you and to be the beneficiaries of your generosity. Really, thank you so much. Everybody, thank you for being here tonight. I wanted to just mention one other thing. I think starting later this week, we're going to have bumper stickers available that say "Bring Britney Back." And they're going to be $2.50 just to cover the cost of postage and printing. And we're going to have a discussion at some point in December about the intersecting oppressions that her incarceration represents. So keep an eye out for that. And if you want to buy a bumper sticker, we want to make sure that people don't forget about her. It's just a terrible, terrible, terrible situation and not unrelated to what we've been discussing here tonight. So I wish you all blessings and of the holiday season, and I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving. And I am very grateful for all of you, and Chris, especially for you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Great program. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take good care, everyone.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.